What I want to talk about today is one of the most overlooked pieces when it comes to breath work. What we're talking about is really the kind of relationship between posture and breathing. In my mind, in my experience, what I teach, you can't really separate these two things. And just to prove this as a point, right? If you change the shape of your body, right? If right now you kind of round your shoulders and round your back and kind of your breath is going to conform to that new shape. You don't need to change your breathing. It has to change based on the change in the shape of your body. And the vice versa, if you kind of open up, you get taller, you open the chest, right? Your breath is going to reflect that change in shape. It's going to become a bit deeper, a little bit bigger, a little bit more efficient. And so what I want to kind of talk about today is like why that happens and what we need to be aware of when it comes to our posture, the way we hold our body, the influence that that has on breathing, and therefore the influence that that has on the way that we feel, right? The state of our nervous system, our energy, our emotions, our stress levels, all these really, really important things that are stemming from our baseline physiology. So let's kind of have a quick look at this, right? If we really consider, get to experience my drawing here, right? If we have the rib cage, right? Inside the rib cage, we have our pair of lungs. Below the lungs, we have our diaphragm. Breathing is really about pressure management, right? Inside this space is called intrathoracic pressure, right? The pressure inside my thoracic cage, right? In other words, my rib cage. Down here, right, below the diaphragm is intra-abdominal pressure, the pressure inside my abdomen. And out here, right, outside of the body is just atmospheric pressure. Right? This is all going to make sense in a moment if you stick with me, right? Air moves based on pressure. It is that simple, right? And this is a really important concept to understand. It is the change in pressure that results in air either flowing into the lungs or flowing out of the lungs, right? A law or a rule is that air will move from high pressure to low pressure, right? It loves to equalize. And so outside of our body, right, is this atmospheric pressure, the pressure of the atmosphere, gravity, right? Inside our body is different. When I go to inhale, what happens? Right, the diaphragm, this big kind of parachute or dome shaped muscle, it descends, right? It moves down and it flattens out, and the rib cage moves outward. So this space here gets bigger. When the space gets bigger, the pressure inside drops, right? More room, less pressure. And the result of that is air is going to flow in from outside, right? Because now that that space has got bigger, the pressure outside is higher than the pressure inside, and it equalizes. The air flows in. The reverse occurs, right? As we exhale, the diaphragm goes up, the rib cage gets smaller, right? It kind of compresses or it contracts, which means the pressure inside the chest gets higher, and that forces the air back out because of that pressure differential. Big scary word, right? Just meaning like there's a difference between the pressure outside and inside. What has this got to do with posture? Well, the shape of our body determines how well we can create that change in pressure. So we could tell someone, hey, go and take a deep breath. But if they don't have the capacity to change their shape, right? If their rib cage is really stiff, their diaphragm is really tight, they can't take a deep breath, right? It is limited by muscular tension, joint stiffness, right? Behavior in terms of like how I hold my body on an ongoing basis determines, right? How well I can move my body. Many people, whether we blame our phone, right? Whether we blame sitting at a desk, whether we blame a more sedentary lifestyle, but a lot of people aren't moving the way that they used to. And what's happening is the breath is kind of like shrinking to conform to this limited movement. I find it really hard to change the shape of my rib cage, which means I have less impact on, right, my ability to actually change pressure inside the lungs, right, or inside the rib cage versus outside. And so my ability to kind of quote unquote take a deep breath or change the volume of my breath is really limited. When we can't take a deep breath, we have to take lots of breaths. Right? So the second piece of this that I want to really kind of highlight here, and let me just kind of jump back to the whiteboard, is if we kind of really consider, now I'm just going to see if we can clear a little space here. If we consider that we have, right, a demand of how much air the body needs, right? For the average male adult, this is about 6 liters per minute, right? So I need to move about 6 liters of air per minute to provide enough resources, right? This exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, to give enough oxygen, right, for my body to kind of run. So this is the demand, right? This is how much my body needs. Now, the smaller the person, the less that volume, the bigger the person, the higher that volume. We're just going to use 6 because it's a nice, even standard number. Now, how I get to that 6 liters per minute, there's a few different ways. I could take 6 1-liter breaths to get to 6 liters. I could take 12 half-liter breaths and still get to 6 liters, right? Or I could take 24, right, quarter liter or 250 milliliter breaths, and I'm still going to arrive at 6 liters. So we need 6 liters, right? How we get there is variable. What's really important to understand is the person that takes 6 breaths a minute versus the person that takes 24 breaths a minute are going to have a very different outcome in their nervous system, right? The higher the respiratory rate, right? The higher the heart rate. And let's see if I can shift this across a little bit, faster the brain waves. What does this look like? Well, now my nervous system is a little ramped up, right? So the person that's breathing 24 times a minute is going to have an elevated heart rate, higher blood pressure, faster brain waves, which we associate with busy mind, thinking, anxiety, overwhelm, right? This is really stemming from this input, which is like, I'm breathing a lot of times per minute. The person that's breathing 6 times per minute, because they have the capacity to take that nice big 1-liter breath, is going to have a lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, lower sympathetic nervous system activity, slower brain waves, which we associate with feeling calm, being regulated, right? Being, having the time and the space between stimulus and response. I'm less reactive. So why can't we just breathe slower, right? We could tell people, hey, just take less breaths per minute. But if the limitation is their physical shape, the movement of their body, their posture, they can't just simply breathe less because they can't take a 1-liter breath. They can only take a 500 milliliter breath or perhaps a 250 milliliter breath because the diaphragm is tight and braced and held and the rib cage is stiff because they spend 8 hours at a desk every day, or they're hunched over their phone, or lo and behold, they had a back injury, or maybe it's a mother that's had a couple of pregnancies. We've got these changes in biomechanics. Why it's so important to start, right? To start with the mechanics of breathing rather than jumping to, hey, breathe slowly, or do this breathing practice, or do this breathing protocol. We first have to actually establish, do you have the ability to change the depth of your breath? Or are you so kind of conditioned into this shallow breathing because of your posture, the shape of your body, the tension that you're holding, that we're kind of working downstream of the actual root cause, right? Ask someone to breathe slowly, but they can't deepen their breath. They're only going to be able to do that momentarily before their body just overrides and says, this isn't possible. We teach a kind of methodology in our practitioner program that starts with mechanics, right? How we breathe, the movement of the body, the posture. Once we change that, right? Once we kind of unlock more freedom in the body, we can then start to work on physiology, right? Which is the gas exchange. This is where we deliver oxygen to ourselves, remove waste. This is how we produce energy. Once we can start to play with physiology, it kind of opens the door into the nervous system. Now we can begin to kind of regulate and use these tools to change the way I feel. And so that pathway, we do kind of have to start at the base, which is the mechanics of breathing. Before we can interrupt or adjust physiology, before we can start to regulate the nervous system, these things are downstream. One of the biggest problems I see in terms of breath work is people aren't looking at how someone is breathing. They're not assessing ribcage mobility, diaphragm strength and mobility, breathing patterns, right? They're jumping straight to the tool or the intervention. Breathe like this. Here is this breathwork practice. But time and time again, I see it all the time. You do breath work with dysfunctional breathing, you do not get the outcome that you're looking for. we first have to correct and restore breathing to its optimal state so we can actually play with all these wonderful tools that we call breathwork. So if you're a practitioner, you're a breathwork facilitator, what I'd encourage you to do is really have a look at how someone is breathing. Does their rib cage have the capacity to change shape? Does their diaphragm move, right? Do they have enough range of motion that they can take a deeper breath so that we can then work to slow breathing down? Because there is a direct correlation, right? The less number of breaths you take per minute, the healthier your cardiovascular system, nervous system, right? Your entire biology. There's a saying in the yogic philosophy that we are born with a number of breaths, right? The person that's breathing 20 times a minute is going to burn through those breaths a lot faster than the person that's breathing 6 or 8 or 10 times a minute. And so checking in and noticing, like, how many times a minute do I breathe? And if that number is above 12 in my mind, then we want to kind of look at, maybe I can't take a big enough breath to breathe less times per minute. This isn't an issue with me needing to learn how to breathe slower. It's an issue with me needing to learn how to breathe bigger with less effort. Really important piece, right? Check in with the mechanics of breathing first, bring that back to its kind of like optimal state before we begin to play with trying to teach someone how to slow down or to manipulate their breath in any way, right? This methodology of mechanics, physiology, nervous system is the kind of core of what we teach. If that's interesting to you, there's a link under this video where I'll just kind of talk you through the methodology that I work with myself, my clients, that I teach our practitioners. Maybe it's of interest to you. Otherwise, I want you to take what I've spoken about in this video and apply it, right? Because it's in the application that we actually start learning and changing people's lives.